You've probably heard this term floating around, right? Londonistan. It's this really loaded word that paints a picture of London being, well, secretly taken over. But what's the real story here? Is there any fire to go with all that smoke? Well, that's what we're here to figure out. We're going to dive into the data, unpack the arguments, and see what's really going on. Let's get right into it. And this quote right here, it just perfectly captures that core fear. This idea of a great Western capital succumbing to Islamic infiltration. I mean, it's a powerful and frankly pretty alarming thought. So where on earth did this narrative come from, and does it actually hold up under scrutiny? All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the demographic reality of Londonistan. Then we'll lay out the actual case for infiltration. After that, we'll dig into the context and the counterpoints that challenge that case. And finally, we'll talk about what this all means for London's future. So let's kick things off with the absolute foundation of this entire narrative, the numbers, right? The whole claim of a takeover is built on the idea of a massive, overwhelming demographic shift. But what does the data actually tell us? Okay, so the very first thing we have to do is just ground ourselves in reality. According to the 2021 census, Muslims make up 15% of London's population. 15%. Now, yeah, that's the second largest religious group, but it's still way behind Christianity. And get this, it's almost half the number of Londoners who identify with no religion at all. So the numbers themselves tell a very different story. So you might be asking, if the citywide number is only 15%, why does this takeover idea have so much staying power? Well, it really comes down to concentration. In certain boroughs like Tower Hamlets, things just look different than they did a few decades ago. You see more mosques, more women wearing headscarves, more halal budges. It's these really visible, on-the-ground changes that fuel that fear of parallel societies starting to take root. Okay, so now let's actually steelman the argument. Let's explore the case for this idea of infiltration. To really do that, we have to understand the three main pillars that this entire argument rests on. These three pillars are 1. Political power, 2. Social enforcement, and 3. Something called legal dualism. When you put them all together, they're used to paint a picture of this systematic effort to undermine traditional British society. So let's take a look at each one, starting with political power. For critics of what's happening in London, the election of Sadiq Khan back in 2016 was it. It was the ultimate symbol of this perceived takeover. In their eyes, he wasn't just a Labour politician who happened to be Muslim. No, he was framed as a representative of Islamic interests. And his focus on diversity and inclusivity was seen as a smokescreen for chipping away at the city's traditional culture. Now, the second pillar is where we get the most visceral imagery. You might remember this. Between 2013 and 2014, these videos of so-called Muslim patrols went absolutely viral. They showed a group of radicals in East London harassing people for stuff like drinking alcohol or dressing immodestly. And man, did those videos create a powerful, lasting image that, hey, parts of London are no longer governed by British law. And that brings us to the final pillar, the existence of Sharia councils. The argument here is that these councils are basically operating as a parallel legal system, a kind of state within a state that directly undermines the authority of British courts. And this, of course, fuels the whole idea that English common law is slowly but surely being replaced. Okay, so that's the argument for infiltration, laid out plain and simple. But what happens when we start to look a little closer at the actual evidence? Let's bring in some, much-needed context. Right, let's circle back to those Muslim patrols for a second. The claim is really clear and simple. They are proof that Sharia law is being enforced on the streets of London. But here's the thing that almost always gets left out of those viral clips: the context. This was the work of a tiny, and I mean tiny, extremist fringe group. They were immediately condemned by mainstream Muslim organizations and local mosques, and the guys who did it, they were arrested and jailed. The crucial point here is this: this wasn't a movement, it was a crime. And what about the Sharia councils? The myth, as we said, is that they're a parallel legal system. The reality? Well, they're voluntary arbitration services, used mostly for things like religious divorces. They have absolutely no power over criminal law, and they operate entirely under British law, specifically the Arbitration Act of 1996. And instead of infiltration, let's just talk about contribution for a second. British Muslims contribute over £31 billion to the UK economy every single year. That number doesn't really scream hostile takeover to me. It suggests a community that is deeply invested in the country's success. And beyond that, the very idea of some unified Muslim bloc that's secretly orchestrating a takeover, it's just a fantasy. The community is incredibly diverse. It's fractured along ethnic lines. You've got people of Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Somali, Arab descent, and also along sectarian lines like Sunni and Shia. They have different interests, different political views, and poll after poll shows the overwhelming majority reject extremism and identify strongly with being British. So, all of this brings us to our final section. We've looked at the claims, we've looked at the context, and we've looked at the counterarguments. So what does this all mean for London today? Is the defining story really one of conquest, or is it something else entirely? Let's just ask the question directly. After weighing all the evidence we've just talked about, is what's happening in London a story of infiltration, or is it a story of integration, even if that process is messy and complicated? The conclusion from all the source material seems pretty clear. If infiltration means some coordinated secret plot to seize control and replace British law, then the evidence just isn't there. Sadiq Khan operates within a secular political framework, Sharia councils have no criminal power, and those Muslim patrols were a fringe criminal act, not a revolution. Look, the rapid demographic change happening in London is real, and it has created real cultural tension. But the story isn't a battle for conquest. It's really a struggle for cohesion. The real challenge, the real question, is about the difficult, ongoing work of building a unified identity in a truly global city. That is the question London is facing today.